My planer has just been sitting on a set of wooden benches over here where it was impossible to use. There were no wheels, it was too low, kind of trapped. Got to pick it up, carry it over here, set it on the bench, set everything up. And if you need it 3 or 4 times throughout the day, but it's in the way on the workbench, you repeat that operation over and over again. So I decided I needed to get some sort of a stand. And this is what I ended up building. This is almost entirely made out of things that have just been laying around. It's scrap lumber that a lot of people would have thrown away. In fact, it's things that were made into one project and have been taken apart and scrapped out and then repurposed into this project. This cabinet box was originally made when we did the house, and we ended up not using it in the kitchen. And I was hoping that just adding casters to it would be all I needed to do. Seems awfully simple, but it's a little bit on the tall side, so I don't think I'm going to go with that. And if I bring it down a little bit, it not only will fit under that shelf, but it should line up just right with the top of the table saw for an outfeed surface, so I think that's what I'm going to do. But that requires a little bit of disassembly without destroying the cabinet, so I'm going to do my best to take this kind of easy and not be overly aggressive with it. This would be one advantage of not assembling things with glue and just putting it together with screws. Screws are much more gentle to disassemble, doesn't require hammering, prying, any of that kind of stuff. Although I did put this cabinet together originally with nails to hold it while I put the screws in. And that's not too bad. The nails should cut off pretty readily. That's a good use for a multi-tool with a metal cutting blade in it. We can cut through the nail heads. And like I say, that way I don't have to do a whole lot of heavy hammering or prying to get this stretcher out of here so I can move it. On the other side, I can just pull it apart, so that's going to be easy enough to take that out. But I want to put this stretcher back in before I cut it down so that I'm not putting any stress on an unsupported cabinet side while I'm cutting it. I think instead of screws in the side of the cabinet like I had it, I'm going to go with pocket screws. I think for simple construction, pocket screws are an ideal way to go. Looks like this board's got a knot in it, and I got to get through the knot, but that's not a big deal. One of the downsides to pocket screws is they like to shift when you put the screws in. They'll pull in just a little bit the direction of the screw. So I'm going to clamp a block in here, and hopefully that will hold this just exactly where I need it for the screw to go in. I'm using the Craig jig, and they make all sorts of clamps and things that help make this easier. None of it is exactly perfect every time, but it does help. Now that I've got that stretcher put back in, I can take this nailing rail off the back of the cabinet, and I will reset that later. And it's back to the pocket hole jig to put pocket holes in the other stretcher, and I'm going to do the exact same thing on that side and get this all stiffened back up again with these stretchers lowered. I think it was 3 1/4 inches is what I finally ended up going with. Really, on rough shop furniture like this, you can probably get away with a handheld cut, but I'm going to go ahead and use a track saw and try and do as good a job as I can. It's also good practice for future projects. I bought this Festool track saw probably 12 years ago when it was one of the few track saws out there. The other ones had really bad reviews, so I went ahead and invested in the Festool. Now there are so many good track saws out there. You should be able to find one that fits your budget if you're looking for a track saw. But it is really handy for working with sheet goods. I'm going to reattach that hanging rail. I'm putting it on the inside so that it does not add any dimension to the back of the cabinet like it did previously. And I think this will be a better solution. A few screws from the top and, of course, a couple of pocket screws in the back. Because I'm using as much salvaged and scrap material as I can, I don't have a piece of plywood that's the exact right size for the back of this. But I did find 2 pieces of 3/8 plywood that between the 2 of them I can make it fit. So I cut those down and I can piece that in together on the back of the cabinet. I'm just going to nail this in. Screws might be nice, but there should be no stress on this, so I don't think there's any problem with nails. It's quick and efficient. One of the advantages of those hardware store tool cabinets that I've got is that I can take the drawers out and take the supplies that are in it to the project. So I can just bring this drawer over and put it right on the cabinet, and I don't have to grab a handful of nails out of it. I just take what I need as I need it. Hammer I'm using is actually one I made in the blacksmith shop. So this is a claw hammer we forged on Black Bear Forge. If you're interested in that, that video's over there. And I think that will do it for the back of the cabinet. Everything's nice and square. This will keep it in shape, and I don't have to worry about the cabinet being wobbly. I am going to put a drawer in the bottom of this, so I need some drawer spacers. Again, I'm using an assortment of salvaged bits of plywood. I don't have anything large enough on hand to completely fill the space and do this with single piece on each side. So it's going to be pieced together with 2 parts on each side. It does add to the complication a little bit when you're using scrap material, but there's absolutely no reason not to on a project like this. This is just a quick down and dirty, minimal expense to make this happen. Really, really easy to just put the pieces in and mark them. You don't have to worry about taking a measurement. Just mark it and cut it. I will glue these rails in just to keep them good and tight to the side, and because this is all plywood, it doesn't really matter that the grain direction is running different. This might be an issue if you're using solid boards, but glue and screw is going to hold this very well. This will help define the drawer space and give me a platform where I can put the bottom shelf in later. And again, I can just bring these drawers from the hardware cabinet over here, so I've got the screws right where I need them. This project's light enough it can be put up on the workbench, which is nice. I don't have to work on the floor the whole time. I really don't like working on the floor anymore. I've kind of aged beyond the point where I want to get down on my hands and knees any more than I absolutely have to. Now that bottom shelf, I don't have plywood for it, but I do have some cutoffs of some old particle board shelving. That, of course, is not the right size, so I'm ripping this down and putting it in 3 pieces, 2 smaller pieces in the back and a full-width piece in the front. I've also got these old melamine shelves. I don't remember where I got these or what they were originally used for, but it's something I've had around forever. I thought this would be a great top, but it's just a little bit small, and I would really rather have something that covers up a little bit and maybe even has a little bit of an overhang. So I have this piece of plywood that was once a clamp rack. This held my big hand screws, the wooden hand screws. And the plywood is big enough. It's got a lot of stuff attached for holding the hand screws. And of course all of this is glued in place as well as put on with screws. So it's going to take a bit of demolition. And this is one of the big downsides of using salvage material. You end up spending a lot of time disassembling things. You've got to break things apart, deal with glue, screws. In this case, I'm going to have a lot of holes in it from where all these pegs and things went through. But I think for this project, that's okay. It would be ideal to have a solid piece of plywood, but I think I can make this work. So pry bar and the claw hammer get a lot of work on this. And because the glue is generally stronger than a lot of the wood, I leave some of the plywood behind. I'm ending up splitting off that veneer on the outside of the plywood, and in some cases, even leaving quite a bit of the core of the plywood attached. So it's going to take some more cleanup besides just tearing this stuff off. But the first step is to get all this junk out of the way. And this will almost all be trash. The old dowels that were in here I'm able to salvage, and I might use that for some hanging rack again in the future. Just cut them a little bit shorter to get rid of the crud. But the plywood scraps are truly scrap, and they're just going to go in the trash at this point. I have no reason to even try to salvage those pieces. And of course, some of this is more stubborn than others. Using new plywood, I would have had the top done in half the time as it takes me just to tear this apart. It would have just been a matter of cutting it to size and putting it onto the cabinet. But it uses a lot of this stuff up. Some of it's been sitting around for years. This thing I just took off the wall when we built the rolling clamp cart, so it hadn't been around that long, but I had no plans on what I was going to do with it, and I didn't think it would ever be used as a clamp rack, so I'm pretty happy to use it for this. This wide chisel is really good for trimming off that bit of plywood that's left behind. It allows me to get right down to the top of this piece of plywood. I'm not really worried about this looking pretty. This will be the underside, and all the holes keep it from looking good anyway, so it's just going to be what it's going to be. This is something to accept the flaws in the salvage material, and it gives a little bit of character to the cart, I suppose. And you can always talk about how much money you saved by doing it this way. I am going to trim off the outer edges and center the holes so that they are kind of centered on this cabinet. Not that it really matters that much, but it will give me nice clean edges on the outside of the top, just in case I ever want to band it to make the whole thing look pretty in the long run. Or look less rough in the long run, I should say. Pretty is probably never going to be the way to describe this. So I'll center that overhang, and I'll clamp it down so I can, you guessed it, put some screws in it, and that will hold this. It doesn't need anything fancy at all. It doesn't need a lot of screws in it. Just 2 or 3 front and back in the stretchers is all this really needs. I don't know about you, but I've noticed that all these screw guns don't seem to drive screws very well when they're in reverse. So it does help to set the thing to run forward. I don't know how often I do that to myself. I'm using it to take screws out of one thing and put screws back in somewhere else. I always forget to change the direction of the driver. Now, I haven't really thought very well about how I'm going to hold the back of this down. It's got a little bit of a bow in it. But luckily, I've got these great big slots left from the blocks that held the clamps. And that's just perfect to put these clamps in and clamp it down while I put screws in there. Kind of fortuitous, I think. I certainly wouldn't cut holes in it just for this purpose, but it was nice that they were there and I could use them for that. Put a few screws in the back, and that's really all this top is going to need. And that much of the cabinet is pretty much done. And it's time to go ahead and put the planer on there and see how this all works. Planer weighs right about 100 pounds. I think it might be just a hair over 100 pounds, and I'm really going to be glad to not have to lift this up and move it and put it on the bench and take it off and put it back where it was. It was a real nuisance, and I resisted moving it when it was in my way just because I didn't want to have to pick it up and move it again later. So with a rolling cart, this is going to be a lot better. Just using lag bolts into the plywood, this is not going to have any big upward force. You just want to make sure it doesn't slide off the top. If you're moving it around, you don't want to drop the planer on the floor. And the bolt holes are right next to the plywood side, so there wouldn't be room for a nut and a washer anyways. That fits perfectly. And this bottom shelf then is a perfect place for this 2x72 belt grinder or sander that Blacksmith Supply sent me. This is really a tool meant for knife making in the blacksmith shop, but it is so handy in the wood shop, and I have other grinders in the blacksmith shop, that I am keeping this one down here in the wood shop, and I find it more useful than a lot of woodworking specific belt grinders. Again, I've got salvage material, things left over that used to hold clamps. These held C-clamps. And I want to make a drawer, so I'm going to use these for drawer material. I don't have any other suitable material that I'm willing to cut into. I've got some really nice boards, but they have other purposes, and I'm not going to cut them up to make a drawer for this cabinet. So I need to get rid of these dowels. That leaves something sticking out there we need to move. If only there was a perfect tool for cleaning that down and making the front of that board flush. Also a great opportunity to give a test run of the planer and see how everything works. And it looks like it's working pretty well, and the board comes right out on top of the table saw so I don't have to worry about the table saw being in the way. So that plan worked out just the way I expected it to. And those dowels are going to be right where I have to rip this for the drawer. So I've got these little decorative dowel pieces in there that don't mean a thing. It's just going to be drawer slides and nobody will ever notice. I make the sides the full depth that I want them. It's just slightly less than the depth of the cabinet so that the drawer is not bumping into that nailed-on back panel every time you close it. I don't want to use the drawer as a hammer to hammer the nails loose. It's just going to be an 1/8 or 1/4 inch short of fitting full depth. If you've noticed, the miter saw has been moved. I'm working on a cabinet for that. That'll be a future video when I finally get that completed. It's just barely enough of a countertop at this point to hold the miter saw, a long way from being completed. So it'll be a few weeks before we see that. Using the drawer sides in there, I can get my measurement for the drawer front. I'm going to run a groove for the plywood bottom. I'm just using my regular blade, so I'm going to have to readjust the fence. I'll actually run this 3 times, taking a little bit less than a full blade width the second 2 passes, just so I can sneak up on the 1/4 inch thick drawer bottom. And this is someplace where I actually have some pretty nice stuff. This is stuff that was cut for another purpose that has never been finished, and so I'm going to go ahead and just use it for this. I've had these panels stacked up for several years, so this is one of the nicest pieces of material that is going to go into this project, is that drawer bottom. Again, pocket screws are all I'm going to use for assembling this drawer. They're on the outside of the drawer front and bottom, and that way they won't show once the drawer face is put in. You won't be able to see them if that's something you're concerned about in nicer cabinetry. And for nicer cabinetry, I might not use pocket screws, but they are so simple and easy, and for shop furniture, I think they're just about the ideal thing to use. I do need to kind of keep this all together so that I can get the pocket screws in right. Here's another one of those fancy clamps from Craig. This one does not really pull the joint together. It will hold it, but you got to get it all lined up first, otherwise it does not suck the joint together. Some of their other clamps will actually pull the joint together for you. But this will do the trick, and it helps me get the pocket screws in without the front and the back shifting and misaligning as I put the screws in. Because the drawer sides are full length, the screws are being installed across the pull direction, and that means the whole thing will be stronger. If you put these in the other way, you'd be pulling against the screws, and there's a slim chance you could strip them out at some point. So you always want to think about that when building drawers, is what's the direction of the stress. Because like I say, this doesn't always auto-align this for you. You've got to kind of tap it into place and get everything aligned and tighten the clamp up, and it could be a little bit of a nuisance. This is a situation where a brad nailer to temporarily brad these together and then put the screws in would really be handy. And I don't currently have a brad nailer, but I think this has convinced me that I would like to have one in the shop. It would really make this process go a lot smoother and improve accuracy, I think. But with the front face in, I can now use that to get a good measurement from my plywood bottom. And I'll rip that to width and then use the drawer again to double check my length measurement. You can calculate all this based on the depth of the groove and the outside width of the drawer, but it's easy enough to just take the measurements right off the drawer. The bottom fits in there very nicely. There's just a little bit of a hump in the plywood, but that actually means it's going to be less rattly once it's installed, so that's okay. Then we'll cut the panel to length and go ahead and install the back of the drawer. And this goes in the same way, but it's easier to align with that plywood in there. That really helps take care of a lot of the alignment issues, so it goes a little bit faster and easier. Again, I think brad nailing from the side would be the way to go, as long as it doesn't bother you aesthetically to see those brad nails. Again, on kitchen cabinetry or fine furniture, you might not want to take that approach. But for shop furniture and simple kitchen cabinetry, it would not bother me a bit. And if they are countersunk and you can fill the holes, you probably would never know even on nicer furniture. Nails and brads aren't really just a modern convenience. They are a very old tool and have been used throughout history, and they really aren't out of place in a lot of things. Sometimes I will use square cut nails if the nails are going to show, just so they do add some aesthetic value to it. The drawer front is simply screwed in place from the inside, and that will hold the drawer front, and it overhangs enough to bump into those guide rails so that that is my drawer stop instead of hitting that back panel. I had this hand-forged handle. I don't remember when I made that. It has been around for ages. It's the only one like it I have, and this seems like a perfect use for it. I do prefer slotted screws for installing iron hardware because I think they look better with the forged iron, but that's just an aesthetic choice. So that is a 100% functional drawer, very simple, no stress building it hardly. Also is just the right size to hold all the sanding belts for my little belt sander. As shop furniture goes, this is about as ugly as it gets. There's a lot of materials here that are mismatched. Some has a finish, there's some particle board, there's plywood, there's pine lumber. Who knows what else might have ended up in this. I didn't really keep that close a track of it. The only thing I actually paid for specific to this project were the four casters. That was about $65 or something. They're fairly decent 3-inch casters. But this is 100% functional. And if I wanted to look better, I can get something like that thin 1/4-inch beadboard they sell at the home centers for doing paneling on your walls. That would look real good over that rough construction grade plywood. And it would be easy to build a face frame and put a door on there that kind of covers up that little grinder. Not only does this make it easier to get out and put in use, it sits over here a little bit and I don't have the big mess of dust hoses that I got to run overhead so I can get around this thing, and my cord isn't running across the floor where it's a tripper. So it's a lot more convenient to use. The outfeed table on this is in line with the table saw, so I can use that as an extension for my outfeed, and that works out really nice. And it gives me a place to put that little 2x72 belt grinder that I got from Blacksmith Supply. I really like having that in the shop, but it hasn't had a place to live. I still have to get it out and set it up on the bench, and I'm hoping I can figure out some sort of a swing out or a lift or something on that so that becomes a little easier. But that's a whole nother can of worms, and I'm not even worried about it right now. I'm just happy with the way this came out, even if it is a bit ugly. I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more woodworking videos and the other things that I'm up to outside the blacksmith shop, make sure you subscribe to this channel, the John Switzer channel. If you're interested in the blacksmithing stuff, check out Black Bear Forge. That's where all the blacksmithing stuff is. But one way or the other, we'll see you for the next video.